For 3 years, every Saturday morning, a grocery clerk named Eli Carter carried an old blind woman's bags the 4 blocks from Greenfield Market to her front door. And he never once kept the dollar she tried to fold into his palm. He didn't know her last name. He didn't know she had one worth knowing. He thought she was a lonely widow in a worn wool coat who could not see, and he was right about all of that, except the one part that mattered. Because the woman who held his arm every Saturday, the woman who could not see his frayed collar or his cracked hands or the worry he carried home like a second shift, owned the bank. Her name was carved into the stone of the tower downtown. And at that very moment, in a glass office on the 30th floor of that tower, a man she had never met was preparing the papers that would take Eli Carter's house out from under his wife and his 2 children. 156 Saturdays. That is how many times he had carried her bags for nothing. And not a single one of them was written down in any ledger anywhere in the world, except the one that was about to come due. This is a story about the things we count and the things we should have counted instead. Stay with me all the way to the end, because what a blind woman saw in a man and the rest of the world had stopped looking at is going to stay with you long after this video is over. And before we begin, do me one kindness and tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It always means more than you know. It was 7:40 on a gray Saturday morning in late October, and Eli Carter was already 2 hours into his shift at Greenfield Market on the west side of Cincinnati, restocking the produce wall while the rain came down soft and steady on Vine Street outside. He was 38 years old. He had worked at Greenfield for 11 of those years, long enough that the regulars knew him by name and the new hires came to him before they came to the manager. And his hands knew the work so well, he could build a pyramid of apples without looking, stacking them the way his grandmother had taught him to stack firewood, heaviest on the bottom. Nothing wasted, nothing that would fall. His grandmother had raised him. Her name was May, and she had taken him in when he was 9 years old and his mother could no longer manage. And she had fed him out of a kitchen that never had quite enough and somehow always had enough. And she had given him the one sentence that he had built his whole life around without ever deciding to. "You carry what you can," she used to say, "for whoever's hands are full. And you never keep a ledger." She said it when he complained about helping a neighbor for free. She said it when he wanted credit for being good. She said it the last time he saw her in a hospital bed that the family was still paying off, her hand light as paper in his. You never keep a ledger, baby. The minute you start counting what you gave, you already lost it. Eli was 38 years old, and he could still hear her say it. And he had spent 11 years bagging other people's groceries and carrying what he could for whoever's hands were full. And he had never once kept a ledger. And that, more than anything else in this story, is the reason for everything that happened next. At 10 minutes to 8, the bell over the door rang, and Miss Vivian came in out of the rain. She came in the way she always did, slow and careful, the tip of her thin white cane tapping a path along the base of the produce wall, her free hand out just slightly, her head tilted the way a person's head tilts when they are listening for the shape of a room. She was a small woman, frail in the way the very old are frail. But she carried herself like someone who had once been used to rooms going quiet when she entered them. Her coat was good wool, charcoal gray, a little out of fashion, and there was a small gold brooch at the collar and pearls at her ears, and her silver hair was pinned up neat. Her eyes were clouded, pale, and they did not settle on anything. She had been blind for almost 4 years. Eli knew that. He knew almost nothing else about her, and that was fine with both of them. "Good morning, Miss Vivian," he said, and he watched her whole face change at the sound of his voice. the way it did every Saturday, a small light coming up in it. "Eli," she said, and she smiled. "There you are. I'd know that voice in a crowd of 1,000. How is that boy of yours, the one with the loose tooth?" "Lost it Tuesday," Eli said. "Tooth Fairy left him $2. Now my little one's trying to wiggle out a tooth that isn't even loose yet, just for the money." Miss Vivian laughed, a dry, delighted sound. "A businesswoman," she said. "Hold on to that one." And she put her hand on his offered arm, light and certain, the way she had every Saturday for 3 years, and they began their slow circuit of the store. This was the part of the week Eli did not tell anyone about, not because he was ashamed of it, but because it felt private, like something that belonged only to the two of them. He would walk her up and down the aisles and be her eyes. She had her list in her head. She never forgot a thing. And he would find the items and describe them to her, and she would decide. It had started by accident 3 years before, on a Saturday much like this one, when she had come in alone and gotten turned around near the back of the store, distressed, a carton of eggs in danger. And Eli had quietly set down what he was doing and come to her and said, "Here, miss, take my arm. Let's get you what you need." And he had walked her through the whole store. And at the register, he had carried her bags out. And when she said she lived just up on Hartwell, 4 blocks, he had walked her home through the cold, and she had tried to give him $1. And he had said, in his grandmother's voice without knowing it, "No, ma'am, I don't take money for walking a neighbor home." And she had come back the next Saturday and asked the cashier, very formally, whether the young man named Eli might be available, and he had been available every Saturday since. He described the world to her as they walked, because she liked it, and because he had discovered he was good at it. He had learned that a blind woman does not want to be told a peach is ripe. She wants to be told what ripe looks like. So he would put a peach in her open hands and say, "This one's the color of a sunset just after the sun's gone down, that deep gold going red at the edges, and it gives just a little when you press it, like it's been waiting all summer for somebody to want it." And Miss Vivian would hold the peach and turn it in her fingers, and her clouded eyes would go soft. She would say, "My Walter used to bring me peaches." And Eli would put 6 of the best ones in her basket and never tell her he'd picked through the whole crate to find them. He learned the shape of her week from the things she bought. The good tea, the real cream, a small cut of fish on Fridays, a single slice of pound cake from the bakery counter that she ate on Sundays, she'd told him once, with the radio on, the way she and Walter used to. He learned that she lived alone, that a woman named Della came during the week to read to her and help with what needed helping, that Walter had passed 5 years ago and her sight had started going the year after. And she always spoke of those 2 losses as if they were the same loss, the light and the man, gone together. He never asked her what she had done for a living, or whether she had children, or how a woman who dressed in good wool and pearls had ended up alone in a small house on Hartwell, with no one but a grocery clerk to lean on come Saturday morning. It wasn't his business. His business was to carry what she couldn't and to describe the peaches. And he did it for 3 years, 156 Saturdays, and he never once thought of it as anything other than the most ordinary thing in the world. There was one Saturday Eli thought about more than the others. It was the second winter, a brutal January morning, ice on Vine Street. And Miss Vivian had not come at her usual time. And by 10 o'clock, Eli had a bad feeling he could not explain. And he asked the manager if he could take 15 minutes. And he walked the 4 blocks to Hartwell on the ice and knocked on her door. There was no answer for a long time, long enough that his heart started going. And then the door opened on the chain, and her voice came thin and frightened from the dark inside. "Who is it?" And he said, "It's Eli, Miss Vivian, from the store. You didn't come. I wanted to make sure you were all right." And the door closed, and the chain came off, and she stood there in her robe. And she had fallen in the night. He could see it, a bruise coming up on her cheekbone. And she had been too proud and too alone to call anyone. And she had been sitting in the cold dark since before dawn, afraid to move. He did not make a fuss, because he had learned she could not bear a fuss. He just came in and made her tea and turned up the heat and sat with her until the woman named Della arrived. And he picked up the few things off her floor and found the lamp she'd knocked over and set her world back in order. And when he left, she caught his sleeve and said, in a voice he had never heard her use, "You came to check on me. Nobody comes to check on me." And Eli had said, "Well, I'm somebody, and I checked, so." And she had laughed, even with the bruise, and that was the Saturday he understood that he was not just carrying her groceries. He was, for 1 hour a week, the whole of the world that still came to her door. He did not think he was doing anything special. That was the thing about Eli, the thing his grandmother had put in him so deep he couldn't see it himself. May Carter had cleaned houses on the east side for 40 years, in the very hills where, though Eli would not learn it for a long time, a woman named Vivian Ashford had once lived behind a stone wall. May had raised her grandson on the wages of carrying other people's loads, and she had never once let him believe that the people whose floors she scrubbed were better than she was, nor that the people poorer than them were worse. "There's no high and low in it," she told him. "There's just full hands and empty ones, and a body strong enough to help moves the load from the full hands to the empty for as long as the good Lord gives it the strength, and asks nothing, and keeps no ledger, because the ledger is just pride wearing a number." Eli had buried his grandmother with a hospital bill still attached to her name, the first link in a chain of debt that would one day reach all the way to a manila envelope on his own kitchen table. But he had not buried the sentence. He carried it to work every Saturday, and he carried Miss Vivian's bags, and he never, ever kept the dollar. What Eli Carter did not know, what he could not have known, was that the woman on his arm had spent 50 years being seen for exactly one thing, and that he was the only person left alive who had never once seen it. And what he also did not know, walking her home through the October rain that Saturday, was that on the kitchen table of his own house, 3 miles away, there was an envelope waiting that was going to test his grandmother's whole philosophy down to the last word. If a story about a good man being seen by the one person who couldn't look at him is the reason you're here, then make sure you're subscribed, because this one is just getting started. And what happens when these two worlds finally collide is going to be worth every minute. The envelope was on the kitchen table when Eli got home that afternoon, and Dawn was standing over it with her coat still on, having just come off a double at the nursing home, and the look on her face told him what it was before he'd even crossed the room. It was manila, the color of weak tea, with a glassine window showing his name and the address on Lindale Court. And it had come from Ashford Mutual Bank, the bank that held the mortgage. And the words across the top were the words they had both been dreading for 4 months. Notice of default and intent to foreclose. There was a number that was owed. There was a date, 45 days out, by which it had to be made right. And there was a line near the bottom, in the kind of language banks use, that said, "Ashford Mutual remains committed to helping our borrowers explore available options." And Dawn read that line out loud, and then she sat down at the table very slowly, like her legs had decided the matter without her. I called them, she said. 3 times this month. They keep saying we don't qualify for the hardship program. They keep saying the file's been moved to recovery. She looked up at him, and her eyes were dry, which was worse than crying. Recovery, Eli. Like we're a thing they're trying to get back. Eli Carter and Dawn Carter had bought the little house on Lyndale Court 9 years ago. A 2-bedroom with a patch of yard and a porch that needed a coat of paint. And they had been so proud, the two of them, the first people in either of their families to own the ground they stood on. They had painted Micah's room blue, and then, 3 years later, painted the 2nd bedroom yellow for joy. They were not careless people. They did not miss payments because they were lazy or foolish. They missed payments because 4 years ago, when Joy was born 7 weeks early and spent 31 days in the neonatal intensive care unit, fighting for every breath, the bills had come to more than Eli made in 2 years. And the insurance had covered a portion and left a canyon. And they had been climbing out of that canyon ever since, one payment at a time. And then Eli's hours got cut in the spring when the new owners bought out the Greenfield chain. And Dawn's mother fell ill in the summer and needed help. And the canyon, which they had nearly climbed out of, opened back up beneath them. Here is something most people do not know, and that Eli and Dawn had learned the hardest possible way. In the United States, medical debt is one of the leading reasons families fall into financial ruin, and it does not strike the careless. It strikes the unlucky. Tens of millions of Americans carry it right now, and a great many of them have insurance, and it does not matter, because a single sick child or a single bad diagnosis can generate a bill that no amount of working 2 jobs and skipping lunch can ever fully catch. A family can do everything right, can save and budget, and never once buy a thing they don't need, and still watch a hospital bill turn into a credit problem, and a credit problem turn into a missed payment, and a missed payment turn into a manila envelope on the kitchen table with the word foreclosure across the top. The Carters were not an exception. They were the rule. They were what happens when the most expensive thing in a person's life is the thing they had no choice about, the keeping alive of someone they love. Eli sat down across from his wife and took the letter and read it through twice. And then he set it down and put his rough hand over hers on the table. And he did the thing his grandmother had taught him, which was not to panic in front of the people who needed him steady. "We've got 45 days, he said. I'll pick up more handyman work. I'll take every shift they'll give me. We'll go back to them. We'll call again. We'll find the right person this time. We are not losing this house, Dawn. I promise you that." He believed it when he said it. That was the worst part, looking back. He believed he could fix it with his own 2 hands, the way he'd fixed everything else in that house. The leaking faucet and the busted step and the furnace he'd nursed through 3 winters. He did not yet understand that some things cannot be carried, no matter how strong your back is, and that the bank his money went to every month was not a thing a man could reason with, because it did not have a face. It had a portfolio. And on the 30th floor of a glass tower downtown, a man named Garrett Voss was looking at the Carter file on a screen, and what he saw was not a family. What he saw was a line of data with a note attached. The same note he attached to all of them. Equity position favorable. Recommend proceed. That night, after the kids were in bed, after he had read Joy 2 chapters of her book and checked on Micah and turned off all the lights but the one in the kitchen, Eli sat alone at the table with the letter, and he bowed his head. And he did not pray exactly. He just sat in the quiet with the weight of it. And he thought about his grandmother. And he thought, for the first time in his life, that maybe she had been wrong. Maybe you did have to keep a ledger. Maybe the world ran on ledgers, and the only fool was the man who refused to keep one. Maybe carrying what you could for whoever's hands were full was a luxury for people who weren't 45 days from losing the only home their children had ever known. He did not stay in that thought. He could not afford to. But he visited it that night. The way you visit a dark room to see if the thing you're afraid of is really in there. And then he folded the letter along its creases and put it up on top of the refrigerator where the children could not reach it. And he went to bed beside his wife. And the next Saturday, because it was the next Saturday, and because he did not know how to be any other way, he got up and went to work and carried Miss Vivian's bags home through the cold, and described to her a winter pear the color of candlelight, and never said one word about the envelope on top of his refrigerator, because what would have been the point? She was a blind old widow on a fixed income. There was nothing she could do. He had no idea. He had no earthly idea who he was talking to. Over the next 3 weeks, Eli Carter did everything a strong, decent, frightened man can do, and learned the hard lesson that against a thing with no face, a strong back is not enough. He took every shift Greenfield would give him, and 3 he had to beg for. He put a hand-lettered sign at the market and on 2 telephone poles. Carter Handyman, no job too small. And he spent his evenings and his one day off under sinks and up on roofs and behind washing machines for $30 and $40 a job, coming home after dark with his knuckles split. And Dawn would have a plate warming and a face that was trying so hard to be hopeful that it broke him worse than tears would have. And he called the bank. He called Ashford Mutual 11 times in 3 weeks. And he learned what it is to be a man without money trying to talk to an institution with too much of it. He learned the hold music by heart. He learned to navigate the phone tree to the department called Loss Mitigation, which was a polite name for a place where losses were not mitigated. He spoke to a different person every time, never the same one twice, each one pleasant and sorry and powerless, each one reading from the same script, each one telling him his file had been moved to recovery and did not, at this time, qualify for the available programs. He asked once, his voice cracking, to speak to whoever made the decisions. And a young man, not unkind, told him there wasn't a who exactly, that it was a system, a model, that the file was flagged a certain way, and the flag was the flag. Eli stood in his own kitchen with the phone against his ear and understood that he was arguing with a flag, that somewhere there was a screen with his family on it, reduced to a phrase, and the phrase had decided, and there was no man behind it he could look in the eye, no desk he could walk up to, no human being he could appeal to as one person to another. That was the cruelty of it, the thing that kept him up at night. Not that someone had looked at his family and chosen to take their house. That he could have understood, could have fought. The cruelty was that no one had looked at all. He did the math again and again at the kitchen table, the way you press a bruise to see if it still hurts. The handyman work brought in a few $100s. The extra shifts brought in a few $100 more. And the number the bank wanted sat up on top of the refrigerator like a stone. And no honest arithmetic Eli could do on that legal pad would ever make the small pile at the bottom reach the large number at the top. Not in 3 weeks, not in 3 years. Micah, who was 10 and missed nothing, had started lingering in doorways and asked his mother one night in a small voice whether they were going to have to move. And Dawn had said, "Don't you worry about grown folks' business, baby," in the exact tone that tells a child to worry. And Joy had drawn a picture of the house, their house, the way she always did. And Eli had had to leave the room. 3 weeks became 2. 2 became 10 days. And still, every Saturday, he got up and went to work and carried what he could. and described the winter fruit to a blind woman, and said nothing, because a man does not lay his burdens on the people he was put here to lift. To understand what Eli did not know, you have to go up into the hills on the east side of the city, to a house Vivian Ashford had not set foot in for 3 years. A great stone house behind a low wall with a view of the river, where the furniture was under white sheets and the staff had been let go and the rooms held nothing now but the echo of a marriage that had built an empire. Vivian and Walter Ashford had started with nothing. That was the part the newspapers always got wrong. In the long articles they wrote when Walter died, the part they smoothed over because it did not fit the story of the great financier. They had started in a 2-room rented half of a house on the west side, 4 blocks, as it happened, from a corner store that would one day be called Greenfield Market, in the very neighborhood Vivian still could not bring herself to leave. Walter had been a teller at a bank that would not have lent money to a man like him, a black man in that city in those years. And so he and Vivian had done the only thing they could do, which was to build a bank that would. They had started it at their own kitchen table, a small community lender that gave mortgages to families the big banks turned away, families like the Carters, working people with steady hands and no connections. And they had built it loan by loan, handshake by handshake, over 50 years, into Ashford Mutual, a bank with its name on a tower downtown and $4 billion on its books, and a reputation, once, a long time ago, for being the bank that saw you when no one else would. Vivian had been the heart of it. Walter had the head for numbers, but Vivian had the eyes. She used to say that. "I'm the one who looks at the people, Walter. You look at the papers." She had sat across the desk from thousands of nervous families over the years and looked at them. Really looked. And she had been right about them again and again. Right about who would pay and who would not. Not because of their credit scores, but because of something she saw in their faces. The way they held their children, the way they talked about the house they wanted. Whether they wanted it to flip or wanted it to be a home. For 50 years, Vivian Ashford's eyes had been the secret asset on which a $4 billion bank was built. There was a story Walter used to tell at dinners, when the bank was big and the room was full of important people. And Vivian would let him tell it, because it was true, and because it kept them both honest. In the second year, when Ashford Mutual was still 2 desks and a back room and barely making payroll, a young couple had come in wanting a loan for a little house on the west side, and every number on their application said no. Thin credit, a baby on the way, a husband between jobs. Walter, who looked at the papers, had the decline letter half written. And Vivian, who looked at the people, had sat across from that young couple and watched the way the man's hand kept finding his wife's. Watched the way they talked about the house, not as an investment, not as a step up, but as a place to put a crib, and she had told Walter after they left. "We are going to give them that loan." And Walter had said the numbers don't support it. And Vivian had said, "I'm not lending to the numbers, I'm lending to him. And I've seen his kind. He will pay us back if he has to do it $1 a week for the rest of his life. Because that house is going to be the proof that he is a man. And a man like that does not default on his own proof." They gave the loan. The couple paid it back, every dollar, never once late. And 40 years later, their daughter was a judge, and she still banked at Ashford Mutual, and she had spoken at Walter's funeral. That was the bank Vivian and Walter built. A bank that lent to the man, not the numbers. It is worth holding on to that, because it makes what had quietly happened to that bank in the years of Vivian's grief and blindness all the more terrible, and all the more her own to answer for, the moment she finally learned of it. And then Walter died, in his sleep, beside her, on an ordinary Tuesday. And within a year, as if her body could not bear to keep looking at a world he was no longer in. Her sight began to fail. The doctors called it advanced macular degeneration, accelerated, they said, by the grief, though grief is not supposed to be a medical cause. And they were gentle about it, but they were clear. The eyes that had read 10,000 faces were going dark. Within 18 months, Vivian Ashford, the woman who looked at the people, could not see the hand in front of her own face. She had handed the bank to others to run. What choice did she have? She kept her shares. She was still the majority owner. The name on the tower was still her name. But the day-to-day she gave over to the executives, chief among them a smooth and capable man named Garrett Voss, who had risen fast and who spoke the language of efficiency and shareholder value and portfolio optimization, the language Walter had never quite spoken, the language that had no word in it for the thing Vivian used to do across a desk. And Vivian, blind and widowed and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, had retreated. She had closed up the great stone house in the hills, the house that was full of Walter, and she had moved back to the only place that had ever felt like the beginning instead of the end. The west side, 4 blocks from the corner store, into a small plain house on Hartwell that she and Walter had kept all those years and never sold. The kind of house their first customers had lived in. Nobody on the west side knew who she was. That was the point. To them, she was Miss Vivian, the blind widow in the good coat. And that was all she wanted to be. Because in the hills, she had been Mrs. Ashford, the grieving billionaire, the name on the tower, the woman everyone treated like fine china and no one treated like a person. Here she was, just an old woman who needed help with her groceries. And here, 3 years ago, a grocery clerk had taken her arm and walked her through a store and described a peach to her and refused her $1. And for the first time since Walter died, Vivian Ashford had felt like a human being again instead of a fortune wearing a body. She had come to live for those Saturdays. She would never have admitted it. She was too proud. But Della knew. And Della watched her employer's whole week bend toward Saturday morning like a plant toward a window. Eli did not know that he was the brightest hour of a blind woman's week. He did not know that she repeated his descriptions to Della afterward, the color of a sunset just after the sun's gone down, that she had started eating peaches again for the first time since Walter died, that the kindness of a man who thought she was no one had done what all her money and all her doctors could not, which was to make the dark a little less dark. He did not know any of it. And here is the thing that neither of them knew, the thing that was rolling toward them both like weather. Garrett Voss, in his drive to optimize the portfolio and impress the board and clean up what he called the bank's legacy exposure, the old low-margin community loans Walter Ashford had made to working families decades ago, had quietly accelerated foreclosures across the west side, the very neighborhood the bank had been founded to serve. He had done it without ever mentioning it to the blind old woman whose name was on the building, because as far as Garrett Voss was concerned, Vivian Ashford was a sentimental relic, a signature on a stock certificate, a woman who could not even see the reports and would not understand them if she could. And one of the files in that acceleration, one line of data among hundreds, marked equity position. Favorable, recommend proceed. Belonged to a family on Lyndale Court named Carter. Vivian Ashford owned the bank that was about to take the home of the only man who had been kind to her in 5 years. And neither of them had the faintest idea. Garrett Voss did not think of himself as a cruel man. This is the truth about most of the harm done in the world, that it is done by men who do not think of themselves as cruel, who think of themselves as responsible, as disciplined, as the only adults in a room full of sentimentalists. Voss had come up at the big national banks and had been brought in to modernize Ashford Mutual, to wring the inefficiency out of an institution he privately regarded as a charity that had gotten confused and started calling itself a bank. The old West Side loans were his particular irritation, hundreds of small mortgages at margins that made no sense, made decades ago by a founder who, Voss believed, had let his heart write checks his head should have caught. So he cleaned them up. That was his word, cleaned. He accelerated the delinquent files. He denied the hardship requests as a matter of policy because granting them set a precedent, and he watched the portfolio metrics improve quarter over quarter, and he prepared the slides he would show the board. And at no point in any of it did he see a single human face. Because the entire genius of the system he believed in was that you never had to. On the West Side, where the bank had been born, the manila envelopes went out by the dozen. Families that had paid Ashford Mutual faithfully for 20 and 30 years, families whose parents had been Walter and Vivian's first customers, got the same letter the Carters got, the same glassine window, the same word across the top. Some of them fought and lost. Some of them simply packed. A neighborhood that an old couple had spent 50 years helping to build was being quietly hollowed out, one house at a time, in their name, to make a number on a slide go up. Della Mosby was the only one close to Vivian who saw any of it, and even she saw only the edges. Della handled the correspondence, read Vivian the letters that came to the house on Hartwell. The statements and the notices the bank still mailed to its majority owner out of habit. Dense things Vivian could no longer read herself. And lately Della had grown uneasy, because the figures she read aloud, the foreclosure numbers buried in the quarterly summaries, were climbing in a way that did not match the gentle, careful institution she knew Vivian believed she still owned. She had mentioned it once, softly, and Vivian had said only that Mr. Voss was minding the store, and she was sure he knew his business. In the tired voice of a woman who had handed off the thing she loved because she could no longer bear to hold it. Della had let it go. She would not let it go for much longer. But it would not be a number on a page that finally opened the blind woman's eyes. It would be a voice she knew, on a bench by a window, saying a name. This is the part of the story where everything starts to turn, and I promise you the turn is worth it. If you're not subscribed yet, do it now and turn on notifications, because you're not going to want to miss what a blind woman does when she finally finds out what's being done in her name. It almost didn't come out at all. That's what Eli would think about later, the same way he thought about all the small hinges that the whole thing had turned on. It almost stayed a secret because Eli Carter was not a man who told his troubles to a customer, and Vivian Ashford was not a woman who pried. But Vivian could not see, and a person who cannot see learns to hear what other people miss. And on a cold Saturday morning in early December, with the foreclosure date 3 weeks away and his options gone, Eli Carter walked into Greenfield Market carrying something in his voice that he could not hide from a blind woman. She felt it the moment he said good morning. The light that always came up in her face when she heard him stayed down, and her clouded eyes turned toward him, and she took his arm. And instead of starting their circuit, she stood still, holding on to him, and she said, "Eli, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong, Miss Vivian. Let's get you your tea." "Don't," she said gently. "Don't do that. I have spent my whole life listening to people tell me nothing's wrong. I can hear it in a voice the way you can see it in a face. Something is sitting on you this morning, son. It's been sitting on you for a few weeks now. I've heard it getting heavier. Now I'm an old blind woman, and I've got nowhere to be and nobody to tell. So you walk me to the bench by the window and you sit down with me a minute. and you tell me what's wrong." And Eli Carter, who had not told anyone, who had not even told Dawn how frightened he really was because he had to stay steady for her, found himself sitting on the bench by the front window of Greenfield Market with an old blind widow's hand on his arm. And he told her. He told her about Joy being born too early and the 31 days in the canyon of debt. He told her about the cut hours and his mother-in-law and the climbing out and the falling back in. He told her about the manila envelope on top of the refrigerator and the date 3 weeks away, and the number he could not reach no matter how many shifts he took, and the children's rooms, blue and yellow, that he had painted with his own hands. And he told her, his voice finally cracking, the thing he had not said out loud to a single soul, that he was 45 days, now 21 days, from putting his wife and his babies out of the only home they had ever known, and that he had promised Dawn he would fix it, and that he did not know how, and that for the first time in his life he was beginning to think his grandmother had been wrong, that you did have to keep a ledger after all, because the people he owed certainly kept one. Vivian listened the way she had listened to 10,000 families across a desk over 50 years, with her whole self not interrupting, her thumb moving slowly on the back of his hand. And when he was done, she was quiet for a moment. And then she asked him a question in a voice that had changed, gone careful and very still. "Eli," she said, "what is the name of the bank?" "Ma'am?" "The bank," she said, "the one taking your house. What is its name?" "Ashford Mutual," he said. "Ashford Mutual Bank." And Vivian Ashford went so still and so silent that Eli, alarmed, said her name and reached for her, thinking she'd taken ill. But she was not ill. She was sitting on a bench in a corner grocery store with her late husband's name ringing in her ears, the name they had built together at their own kitchen table to help families exactly like this one. The name on the tower, the name on the stock certificates, her name. And she was understanding, in one terrible rush, what had been done in that name while she sat blind and grieving in a little house 4 blocks away, and to whom, and that the man saying it to her, the one man who had treated her like a person instead of a fortune, the one who carried her bags and described her peaches and refused her $156 Saturdays in a row, was being destroyed by the very thing she owned. "What is your last name, Elisha?" she asked, and her voice was shaking now. "Your full name. I've never asked you. In 3 years, I never asked you." "Carter," he said. "Eli Carter. Miss Vivian, you're scaring me. Are you all right?" Vivian Ashford reached up with one thin hand and touched his face, the way a blind person learns the things they cannot see. Her fingers light on his cheek, on the rough beard, on the tired lines around his eyes that she had heard for 3 years and never seen, and her own clouded eyes filled and spilled over. "Eli Carter," she said, "I owe you an apology that is going to take me the rest of my life to pay. But not here. Not today. Today I need you to do something for me, and I need you to trust me. Even though I have not yet earned it. I need you to take me home, and then I need you to give me 3 days. Can you do that? Can you give an old blind woman 3 days?" He didn't understand. How could he? But he had been trusting her with the small things for 3 years, and so he trusted her with this. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I can give you 3 days." He took her home. He carried her bags up to her door on Hartwell the way he always did. And he did not know, walking back to the market in the cold, that he had just told his troubles to the one person on earth with the power to fix them, and that she was already, behind those unseeing eyes, drawing up a reckoning that had been 3 years and one terrible silence in the making. Vivian Ashford had not been to the tower in 3 years. the morning after Eli told her. She called Della, and she said, in a voice Della had not heard from her since before Walter died, "Get the car. We're going downtown. And put out the navy suit, the good one. I want to be Mrs. Ashford today." The lobby of Ashford Mutual went quiet when she came through the doors. Not the way a store goes quiet, the way a court goes quiet. The young people at the desks did not know her face. Most of them had been hired after she went blind and retreated. But the older ones did, the ones who had been there in Walter's day. And a whisper moved through the marble like wind through grass. "Mrs. Ashford. That's Mrs. Ashford." She came through on Della's arm, and her cane found the floor with a sound like a gavel. And she did not need her eyes to know exactly where she was, because she had walked this lobby 10,000 times. She had chosen the marble. She knew the number of steps to the elevator, and she crossed it with her chin up and her late husband's name above her head. And she rode to the 30th floor. And she walked into the office of Garrett Voss without knocking. What was said in that office, Eli never heard in full. But the bones of it came out later, the way these things do, from assistants who'd been near the door and could not help but hear. And it became, in the months that followed, a story the older employees told the new ones, the day the blind woman came back. She did not raise her voice. That was the thing they all remembered. Garrett Voss, caught off guard, had started smoothly, condescendingly, the way you talk to a sentimental old relic. "Mrs. Ashford, what a pleasant surprise. You really shouldn't have troubled yourself to come all this way. Is there something Della could have handled?" And Vivian Ashford had let him finish, and then she had asked him, quietly, to read her a number. The number of foreclosures the bank had initiated on the West Side in the past 18 months. He had not wanted to. She had insisted, and she was the majority owner, and he read it. And then she asked him to read her another number, the number of those families who had been offered the hardship review the bank advertised, but, she had reason to believe, rarely granted. And then she asked him about a file, a family named Carter on Lyndale Court. "Equity position favorable," she said. "I'm told that's the phrase. Read me the note on the file, Mr. Voss. Read me what your people wrote about that family." And Garrett Voss, who did not understand yet that he was finished, made the mistake of defending himself. He talked about legacy exposure and low-margin community loans, and the fiduciary duty to the shareholders, and the necessity of cleaning up the portfolio her late husband had, with respect, allowed to become sentimentally overextended. He used the word sentimental about Walter Ashford. And then he said the thing that ended him. He said, "These are just numbers, Mrs. Ashford. I know it's hard to see that from where you sit. But at the end of the day, that's all they are. Numbers." And Vivian Ashford stood up, leaning on her silver cane, her clouded eyes turned toward the sound of his voice. And she said, "I cannot see anything, Mr. Voss. I have not seen a sunrise or my own hand or a single human face in almost 4 years. And I can see more clearly than you have ever seen in your life. My husband and I did not build this bank to help shareholders. We built it at our kitchen table to help families that men like you, at banks like this one, would not look at. Every dollar you have ever earned in this building, you earned standing on a foundation that 1,000 families like the Carters laid with their faithful payments, decade after decade, when no one else would give them a chance. And the moment it became convenient, you decided they were just numbers." She let that sit. Then she said, "You are relieved of your position, effective this morning. Della has the paperwork. And every foreclosure you have initiated on the West Side is suspended as of right now, today, this minute, pending a review that I will be conducting personally. I may be blind, Mr. Voss, but this is still my bank. and I have remembered what it's for. Garrett Voss was escorted out of the building by noon, and Vivian Ashford, 78 years old, blind, 3 years a recluse, sat down at a desk on the 30th floor of the tower that bore her name and went to work. Because there was a man who carried her bags every Saturday, whose house she had 3 weeks to save, and she did not intend to be one day late. If your heart is pounding right now, you're not alone. And this is exactly the moment to subscribe so you can see how she makes it right. Because what she does for Eli Carter and what he says back to her is the whole reason this story exists. Eli gave her 3 days. He didn't know what else to do. He went to work, he carried what he could. He came home and held his wife and read to his children, watched the date on the calendar come closer, and he tried not to hope. Because hope, when you're 20 days from foreclosure, is a thing that can break you worse than despair. What Eli could not see those 3 days was that the blind woman had not slept either. The morning after he told her, before the bank, Vivian had sat up most of the night with Della and made her read, slowly, every page of the quarterly summaries she had waved away for 3 years. And she had listened to the figures climb, the West Side foreclosures, the denied hardship requests, the cleaned-up portfolio. And with every number she had felt the full size of what had been done while she hid, and the shame of it had nearly stopped her heart. These were her people. The children and grandchildren of the families she and Walter had said yes to when the numbers said no. And in their hour of need, her bank had handed them the same no the world had always handed them. And she had not been there to overrule it, because she had been 4 blocks away, letting a kind man carry her peaches, hiding from the very work her whole life had been for. She did not let the shame keep her down. That was the thing in Vivian, that the blindness and the grief had buried, but not killed. The same iron that had let her say to Walter, "I'm lending to the man, not the numbers." The morning of the bank, she had Della lay out the navy suit, and she had said quietly, to the dark, "Walter, I let it go wrong, and I'm going to set it right." And for 3 days, while Eli took his shifts and tried not to hope, Vivian Ashford worked the way she had not worked in years. On the phone with the bank's counsel, with her late husband's old allies on the board, pulling files by having them read to her one by one, learning the full scale, and building behind her unseeing eyes. Not just a rescue for one family on Lyndale Court, but a reckoning for an entire neighborhood, and a plan to turn the thing her bank had become back into the thing it was born to be. She would save Eli Carter's house. But she had understood, somewhere in those 3 sleepless nights, that saving one house was the smallest part of what she owed, and that the man who had carried her bags had, without ever meaning to, carried her all the way back to herself. On the 3rd day, a Tuesday, a car he did not recognize pulled up in front of the little house on Lyndale Court, a quiet, expensive car. And a woman he did not know got out of the front, a calm woman in her 50s. And then she opened the back door, and Miss Vivian got out, on her cane, in a navy suit. And Eli came down off his porch in disbelief, because he had never seen Miss Vivian anywhere but the 4 blocks between Greenfield Market and Hartwell. And here she was, on his street, in front of his house, the house with the foreclosure date hanging over it. "Miss Vivian?" he said. What are you doing here?" "Eli," she said. And she reached out, and he took her arm out of pure habit, the way he had 156 times, and she held on to him, and she said, "Will you walk me up to your porch? I'd like to sit down, and I'd like your wife to be there, and your children, because what I have to say, I want to say to your whole family." So Eli Carter walked the blind widow up the steps of his own porch, the porch that still needed paint. And Dawn came out, wiping her hands, confused and wary. And Micah and Joy hovered in the doorway, and they all sat down, and Della stood quietly by the rail. And Vivian Ashford told them who she was. She told them about the kitchen table where she and Walter started a bank to help families exactly like theirs. She told them about the tower with her name on it. She told them, her voice catching, about going blind, and going into hiding, and handing her life's work to men who had forgotten what it was for. And she told them, with a shame so naked that Dawn began to cry just hearing it, that the bank taking their home was her bank, that the suffering of these past months had been done in her name while she sat 4 blocks away, letting a kind man carry her groceries and never once knowing his last name. "I owe your family a debt," Vivian said. "That has nothing to do with money. And I am going to pay the money part first because it's the part I can fix today. And then I am going to spend whatever years I have left on the rest. The default on your home is forgiven, not delayed. Forgiven in full, every dollar. And the medical debt that started all of this, my bank is buying it and erasing it, because no family should lose their house over keeping a baby alive. And the fact that mine ever let that happen to anyone is a wrong I mean to make right across this whole neighborhood, not just on this porch. The deed to this house will be transferred to you free and clear. No mortgage. It is yours. It will always be yours and your children's after you. And no Garrett Voss will ever again look at your family and see a favorable equity position." She turned her clouded eyes toward where she heard Eli breathing. "That is restitution, Eli, for a wrong my bank committed. It is not charity, and I will not hear it called charity, and I know you, so I know you're about to argue." And Eli Carter was about to argue. The tears were running down his face, and Dawn was holding on to him, and the children were wide-eyed, and he was shaking his head. And he said, "Miss Vivian, no, I can't. I didn't. I never carried your bag so that I would have done it for nothing. I did do it for nothing. I don't want you thinking My grandmother raised me not to keep a ledger, and I won't have you settling one. I can't take my house as payment for being decent to an old woman. That's not how it works. That's not who I am." And Vivian Ashford smiled, the same dry, delighted smile she gave him over the peaches. Except now it was wet with tears. And she said the thing that he would carry for the rest of his life. The way he carried his grandmother's saying. "I know you'd have done it for nothing," she said. "That's the entire point, Eli, don't you see? For 3 years you kept no ledger. You gave a blind nobody your arm and your time and the best peaches in the crate, and you never once wrote it down or expected a thing. Because your grandmother taught you that the minute you start counting what you gave, you've already lost it. Well, there was a ledger after all. There's always a ledger. But it wasn't yours, and it wasn't the bank's. It was mine. I kept it. 156 Saturdays, every single one. I have them all. I counted what you gave me because you were too good to count it yourself. And son, the balance is so far in your favor that forgiving a mortgage doesn't begin to settle it. You gave me back the world after my husband died. You made an old blind woman feel like a person again. There is no number for that. So let me pay what I can of it, and let me have the joy of it. Because joy is a thing I'd given up on, and you're the one who taught me it was still out there. Now, will you let an old woman do this? Or are you going to stand on that pride your grandmother also gave you and rob me of the best thing I've done in 5 years? Eli Carter could not speak. He got down on one knee in front of her chair, the way you kneel in front of someone you love. And he put his head down and the old blind woman put both her thin hands on his bowed head like a blessing. And Dawn was sobbing. And little Joy, not understanding all of it but understanding the shape of it, came over and wrapped her arms around the strange, kind lady's neck. And Vivian Ashford, who had not been hugged by a child in longer than she could remember, held on to that little girl and wept. "There's more," Vivian said, when she could speak again. "But I'll be quick, because I can hear your wife wondering how much an old woman can say on one porch. Eli, I have a bank to rebuild, and I cannot see. And I need eyes I can trust, eyes that look at people the way I used to. I'm starting something. I'm calling it the Walter and Vivian Ashford Community Fund, and its only job is to do what the bank was built to do: help working families keep their footing. The hardship review's done right this time, fairly, by people who remember what it's like to be on the other side of that desk. I want you to help me run the part of it that touches this neighborhood, not as charity, as a job, a real one, with a real salary. Because you are the most trustworthy man I have met in 50 years of reading faces I could see. And I'd be a fool to let you keep bagging groceries when you could be helping me keep 100 families in their homes. You'd be doing me the favor. And one more thing. And this one is a gift. And you'll let me give it because it's not for you. It's for them." She turned toward the children. "Micah, Joy, there is money set aside, starting today, for school, for college, for whatever you two decide you want to become. Your daddy carried what he could for whoever's hands were full his whole life and asked for nothing. Well, now it's somebody's turn to carry something for him. That's not charity either. That's just how it's supposed to work when the world remembers itself." And then Joy, who was 6, looked up at the blind lady and said, "Miss Vivian, I made you something, but you can't see it." And she ran inside and came back with a card she'd made at school. Construction paper with a house drawn on it and 3 figures and a sun. Except Joy had gone over all the lines with white glue and laid yarn and dried macaroni along them, raised up off the page because her daddy had told her on one of the nights when he came home heavy that the nice blind lady at the store couldn't see colors, only shapes she could touch. So Joy had made a picture a blind woman could see with her fingers. And she put it in Vivian Ashford's hands. And the old woman ran her fingertips over the raised yarn, the walls of the house, the round sun, the 3 little figures. And she understood what it was and what the child had thought to do. And she pressed it to her chest, and she could not speak at all. Some things cannot be put on a balance sheet because they were never on paper to begin with. 1 year later, on a warm Saturday morning in October, Eli Carter walked into the offices of the Walter and Vivian Ashford Community Fund on the west side of Cincinnati, 4 blocks from Greenfield Market, in a building the bank had bought and given the neighborhood. And he hung up his coat, and he got to work doing the thing he turned out to have been born to do, which was sitting across a desk from frightened families and looking at them, really looking, the way Vivian had taught him, and finding the way to yes. He had been nervous at first that he didn't belong, a grocery clerk among bankers. But Vivian had told him that everyone who had ever done any good in that institution had felt exactly that way, including her, including Walter, and that the day he stopped feeling it was the day she'd worry. So he stayed nervous, in the good way. And he was very good at the work, because he had been on the other side of the desk. He had held the manila envelope in his own hands at his own kitchen table, and the families could feel it. That this man across from them had been where they were, and that he was not looking at a favorable equity position. He was looking at them. In the first year, the fund kept 91 families in their homes. Eli knew the number because Vivian made him keep it, the one ledger she insisted on, The ledger of homes saved, because, she said, that's the only kind worth keeping. The kind that counts what you gave back. Dawn cut down to one job. Micah, 11 now, was talking about being an engineer, building bridges. And there was money set aside that meant he could. Joy still drew, constantly, and her pictures had started showing up framed all over Miss Vivian's house, the raised yarn kind, so the old woman could walk her fingers over them whenever she liked. Because Vivian Ashford was at their table every Sunday now. That was the thing that mattered most, in the end. More than the house, more than the job, more than the money, the thing Eli would tell people about years later when they asked how it all turned out. The blind widow who had no one came to the Carters for Sunday dinner every week, in the little house on Lyndale Court that was now theirs free and clear. And Eli would carry her up the steps on his arm the way he always had. And the children called her Grandma Vivian. And she would sit at the head of the table and ask Joy to describe what everyone was wearing, and ask Micah about his bridges, and ask Eli to tell her what the food looked like, because he was still the best in the world at describing things to a woman who could not see. And on the good Sundays, with the radio on, she would have a slice of pound cake the way she and Walter used to. And she would say it was the best thing she ate all week, and she would mean it. And it was not about the cake. And every Saturday, even though he didn't have to, even though he ran a community fund now and wore a tie, Eli Carter still stopped by Greenfield Market on his way home. And if there was an old person in there with their hands full and no one to help, he carried what he could, the 4 blocks or however far. And he never took the dollar, because his grandmother had taught him you never keep a ledger, and because he had learned the deeper truth underneath it, the one Vivian had given him on his own front porch. You never keep a ledger of what you give, but you can trust all the same that somewhere, in some hand you cannot see, the count is being kept. And one day, when you least expect it and need it most, when you are 20 days from losing everything and out of every option a man can think of, the balance comes due in your favor, carried back to you by the very person you helped, who saw you all along, with eyes that could not see at all. I want to tell you something, here at the end, the way I do. When I wrote this story, I kept thinking about all the people we walk past who are keeping us alive without our knowing it, and all the kindness we hand out and immediately forget, the door we hold, the bags we carry, the dollar we wave away, and how we tell ourselves it doesn't count for anything, that it disappears into the air. I don't believe it does. I think there's a ledger we can't see kept in hands we'll never know. And I think Eli Carter was right not to keep his own. And I think his grandmother was right. And I think the only people who lose are the ones who count every dime of what they give and call the rest of us fools. Be a fool. Carry what you can, for whoever's hands are full. You never know who you're really talking to. You never know whose week you're the brightest hour of. And you never know which one of the people you were kind to, back when it cost you something and bought you nothing, owns the bank. So let me leave you with a question tonight. Who has carried something for you when they didn't have to and never let you pay it back? Go tell them you remember. Leave their name in the comments if you want to. I read them, and it always means more than you know. And one real thing before I go. Because this story is gentle, but the trouble in it is not. If your family is behind on a mortgage and afraid of a letter like the one on top of Eli's refrigerator, please know there is free, legitimate help, and you do not have to face it alone or pay anyone to access it. You can reach a HUD-approved housing counselor for free at 1-800-569-4287. They cannot work miracles, but they know your rights, and they are on your side, and calling them is not giving up. It is exactly the kind of caring what you can for yourself that you would do for anyone else. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who's carried something for you and never kept a ledger. Subscribe for a new story every week. And remember, the smallest thing you do for a stranger today might be the very thing that's written somewhere you'll never see, on the page that one day saves your life. Thank you for being here with me. I'll see you in the next one.